Find out what secret chemistry gave Renaissance painters their legendary blues, a luminosity that modern synthetic pigments still cannot fully replicate.
Chapter 1. The Vein of the Sky.
The vast, terrifyingly jagged and torn peaks of the majestic Hindu Kush mountain range rose toward the indifferent sky like enormous fossilized waves of an ancient, violently churned ocean, frozen forever in eternal, monumental stillness by the merciless bone-deep frost and the inexorable passage of time measured in eons. The year was 1450, and the harsh, terrifyingly inhospitable Kokcha Valley, hidden deep in the most remote, least explored, and most inaccessible regions of northeastern Afghanistan, was one of the most isolated, extreme, and dangerous corners of that still largely unknown world. This was an ultimate place where frail mortal man was nothing but a fleeting, defenseless, utterly insignificant speck, cast with brutal indifference against the backdrop of an overwhelming, immovable geological eternity that seemed to mock all human ambition. A biting glacial wind, carrying millions of microscopic fragments of snow, sharp as shattered glass and hard, frozen ice, howled ceaselessly in the narrow, dark crevices of the rock with primal, almost animal rage, carving, gouging and polishing the hard, unyielding granite and dark syenite with an infinite, almost methodical patience, sustained without interruption across countless millions of years. The air, drastically rarefied at this dizzying extreme altitude and stripped of the life-giving density of the lowlands, made even the smallest, most ordinary breath require enormous conscious physical effort, while exhausted lungs burned with a living, invisible fire at every desperate attempt to draw in life-sustaining oxygen. The breathtaking, austere landscape was completely lost in a monotonous, monochromatic palette of muted, earthy hues, dominated absolutely by cold, merciless ochre tones, raw, burnt sienna, deep, light-swallowing matte umbers, all inextricably blended with the overwhelming, ubiquitous gray of the perpetually crumbling, dangerous scree, and of the sharp, bare, wind-exposed ridges where no plant, however hardy, had any right to survive. Yet in this merciless, sterile environment, where Mother Nature seemed to actively and deliberately reject and destroy all forms of fragile life, there existed one hidden, powerful, and inexplicable anomaly. A magnetic force of unimaginable power, drawing desperate, determined, and often starving people from the surrounding poor settlements. A majestic, silent mountain concealing within its dark, frozen, impassable interior an extraordinary treasure whose market and spiritual value far exceeded the purest gold.
In the very heart of this relentless frozen vastness, amid the all-consuming cold and the dominant browns, a young miner, barely into his teens, named Kaveh, was forcing his utterly exhausted body to take one more inhumanly difficult step along the treacherous, ice-slicked path that led toward the black depths of the mine. A close-up on his gaunt yet extraordinarily hard and resolute face revealed a map of premature aging carved by brutal living conditions. His skin was ashen with the pervasive rock dust, deeply chapped and brutally cracked by the merciless frost and the lashing, ice-laden wind. Yet in his dark, sunken eyes burned an unbreakable, desperate spark of determination, fueled by the absolute necessity of sustaining his starving family in the valley below. Every smallest detail of his clothing told a quiet but extraordinarily vivid story of unimaginable hardship, poverty, and desperate struggle for survival in this austere environment. He wore a heavy, uncomfortable tunic sewn from the coarsest homespun wool that scratched his frozen skin with every movement, over which he had thrown an archaic, heavy cloak of thick, battered hide, scratched, worn, and hardened by constant contact with sharp rock edges. His feet, wrapped in thick layers of dirty gray rags and shod in primitive leather sandals, slipped dangerously on the treacherous black ice-covered stones, forcing him into constant nerve-wracking balancing on the edge of the abyss, where one false move meant instant, agonizing death on the sharp rocks hundreds of meters below. He walked in complete ear-ringing silence, listening only to the loud, ragged, and broken rhythm of his own desperate breathing and the fast, deep pounding of his heart, which in this rarefied, freezing air seemed to frantically struggle to break free of his frail chest, creating a drastic, oppressive contrast with the powerful, absolute, and terrifying infinity of the silence of the surrounding, dead, eternally mute mountains.
When Cavey finally crossed the dark threshold of the mine's narrow entrance, the sudden and complete transition from the blinding white glare reflected off the snow into the absolute, dense, almost palpable darkness of the tunnel was drastic, physically disorienting, like being plunged into the depths of thick black ink that instantly devoured every photon of light filtering in from outside. The air within was dramatically different from the air without. The glacial, sharp wind ceased immediately, replaced by a heavy, stale, claustrophobic atmosphere, utterly devoid of movement, dense with invisible, suffocating stone dust that instantly settled on lips and tongue, leaving a bitter, metallic, earthy aftertaste of ancient rock untouched by human foot for millions of years. The only meager source of light in this hostile environment was a handful of smoke-blackened torches fashioned from tar-soaked rags and dry branches, precariously fastened to primitive, creaking wooden props supporting unstable ceilings. Their uneven, lurching orange flames created a highly dramatic chiaroscuro illumination, evoking the darkest, most expressive and tension-filled paintings of Caravaggio, where deep, impenetrable shadows fought for dominance with the aggressive, warm light of fire. In this extraordinarily dense, contrasting light, every smallest movement of the miners appeared distorted, grotesque, and exaggerated, and their shadows danced wildly and unpredictably on the uneven, fractured cave walls, resembling ancient spirits lost in the underworld, condemned to eternal, pointless, and punishing labor in the infernal depths. The documentary, almost brutal attention to visual detail revealed the full horror and misery of their situation. In the torchlight, one could make out the primitive, heavy iron pickaxes with blades blunted by strikes against hard stone, the improvised, moisture-rotted wooden supports that could at any moment give way under the unimaginable pressure of millions of tons of rock hanging above their heads, and the sticky black soot that completely covered every centimeter of their faces, hands, and clothing, rendering them almost unrecognizable, stripped of individuality.
This mine, the harsh, merciless core of their entire wretched existence, was not merely an ordinary place of exhausting physical labor, but a space of deep, almost mythical, semi-religious significance for the entire community inhabiting the Kakcha Valley. The miners, including Kaveh's father, believed deeply and sincerely, with a faith transmitted from father to son through countless generations, that the precious, intensely blue stone they sought was not an ordinary mineral, but literally a vein of heaven itself, a fragment of the perfect, inviolable firmament that at the dawn of time, in an act of divine fury or unfathomable mercy, had torn itself from the celestial vault and plunged with tremendous force downward to bury itself forever in the darkest, deepest, and most filth-encrusted entrails of the hard earth. For young, determined Cave, this unceasing search for lapis lazuli was something far greater than a mere attempt to satisfy basic hunger. It was an unconscious, deeply rooted, desperate striving to touch divinity, to find a fragment of pure, transcendental beauty and infinite light in a world that offered him daily only boundless cold, darkness, suffering, and physical pain. Every blow of the heavy pickaxe against the hard, unyielding wall, every shock transmitted through the wooden shaft to his aching, blister-covered hands, was a prayer for salvation on behalf of his mother and younger siblings who shivered with cold in a flimsy clay dwelling far below in the valley, awaiting his return with a piece of bread purchased for a fraction of the value of that celestial stone. This abyss between the mystical, sublime, almost cosmic legend of stars falling into the earth's embrace and the brutal, filthy, exhausting, dust-filled reality of slave labor underground gave their entire existence a tragic, heartbreaking dimension in which superhuman effort and constant risk of sudden death at the hands of mighty nature were the daily, unquestioned currency with which one purchased another day of meager, comfortless life.
On that particular day, after many fruitless hours of laborious, exhausting chipping at hard, barren rock, Cave and his older, vastly experienced father began their preparations for the most dangerous yet most effective process known in those times, the ancient technique of rock fracturing by fire, a method requiring not only enormous strength but nerves of steel and precise feel for the mountain's caprices. With extraordinary reverence-filled care and in absolute tense silence, they carried to a designated spot at the base of a promising solid rock face armfuls of dry, thorny scrub gathered with great difficulty from the frost-bitten, wind-lashed slopes above the mine entrance, and splints of precious gunnelled firewood, stacking them with extraordinary care into a deliberately planned dense pile pressed directly against the cold, silent surface of the granite. The camera's lens, in the manner of outstanding nature cinematography and macrophotography, seemed to focus on the extraordinary hypnotic details of this preparation, the slow, thick amber flow of pine resin used as a primitive fire starter that stuck to the father's dirty, labor-hardened fingers, the sharp, rough texture of the precisely stacked wood, and the extraordinarily fine, glinting rock dust settling silently onto the dry branches, foretelling the arrival of a destructive force. In the narrow, cramped corridor, the air had grown suddenly unbearably heavy with the pungent, intense smell of raw tar, herbs dried to pepper, and pervasive, biting dust. A full, ominous tension of a storm about to break, a brief, menacing moment of silence before the release of powerful, destructive natural forces in which every tiniest sound, even a quiet breath or a swallow, echoed with unnaturally loud booming reverberations off the damp walls of the underground passage. The father, his face like something carved from old dry wood, deeply furrowed with wrinkles that had accumulated the grey dust of his entire life, produced his flint, struck it with practised ease, and in the spark that danced briefly in the darkness, set in motion a sequence of events that within a few short hours would drastically alter the mountain structure, risking without hesitation the lives of them both for the chance of reaching the legendary vein of heaven. The ignition was sudden, violent, and terrifying in its intensity. The fire, fueled by resin and dry wood, erupted with a powerful hollow roar, instantly consuming the pile and hurling against the dark, cold rock wall aggressive, wildly dancing shadows, transforming the small, claustrophobic chamber into a true, heat-seething hell in which the temperature began to rise with terrifying, unnatural speed. The contrast between the sharp, eye-steam, vivid orange light of the raging flames and the sooty, impenetrable deep black of the surrounding tunnels was striking, almost painful to the eyes. It was a perfect, natural composition in the style of the Baroque masters, where light sculpted dramatic, suffering-filled shapes, exposing the extraordinary, rich texture of coarse wool on the miners' cloaks and the terrifying, murderous effort etched on their faces, drenched in dense, salt sweat. The extreme, scorching heat released by the fire began its brutal, invisible battle with the absolute millennial cold of the rock.
At close quarters, in slow motion, one could almost discern how the solid, hard granite surface began to slowly, imperceptibly sweat tiny gleaming droplets of moisture trapped deep in its pores, how it tensed and deformed under the enormous, rapidly mounting thermal stress. And during the proximity of that element in the narrow, closed, poorly ventilated tunnel underground required almost inhuman, overwhelming endurance and complete suppression of the natural, instinctive fear of suffocation, as the roaring flames consumed the dwindling reserves of precious oxygen with voracious speed, forcing the desperate men to retreat into the shallower, slightly cooler darkness of the corridor, where with mounting anxiety and tension they awaited the critical, decisive moment.
The most critical, most dangerous, and most decisive stage of the entire process had arrived. The shock, rapid cooling of the rock heated to red-hot temperature. The moment at which a man, using the simplest of elements, triggers a catastrophic explosion locked within the earth. Kaveh, trembling with terror, yet driven by necessity, seized the heavy, slippery, rotund water skin sewn from untanned goatskin and filled to the brim with glacially cold, crystalline clear meltwater carried at great effort from the surface. When, at his father's brief signal, the boy hurled the ice-cold liquid with all his strength directly into the very heart of the still blazing, hellishly heated rock, the physical reaction was so brutal, instantaneous, and violent that it resembled a lightning strike in a closed, stifling room. There was an enormous, deafening hiss of escaping steam, like the furious roar of a mythical leviathan awakened from centuries of sleep. An unimaginably dense, scorching, and utterly impenetrable cloud of white, suffocating water vapor instantly filled the entire cramped chamber, completely blinding Kaveh and his father, stripping them for several terrifying, seemingly endless seconds of both vision and the ability to breathe freely, while around them there began to unfold a true, horrifying drama of the destruction of hard matter. Then, piercing through the loud, vibrating hiss of steam expanding in the air, came the sound that every miner feared most in the world, and which simultaneously was the ultimate goal of their murderous labor: the terrifying, sharp, deep crack of granite splitting in tremendous agony, a sound like the breaking of enormous fossilized bones by the hands of an invisible underground titan, a sound heralding both the success of the operation and the immediate lethal risk of catastrophic roof collapse.
Directly following that controlled underground blast, when the deafening echo of the terrifying crack was still restlessly vibrating in the air and in their chests, there settled a moment of such dense, heavy, and unutterably tense silence that it seemed almost physically to crush, to squeeze throats and stifle all attempts at rational thought. The thick, eye and lung-stinging gray-brown smoke from the burned tarry wood had merged with the sharp smell of minerals to create, in the cramped tunnel, a toxic, impenetrable suspension in which lazily swirling, backlit dust motes resembled swarms of furious microscopic insects, creating an almost magical, though mortally dangerous spectacle in the half-darkness. Kaveh and his experienced father remained in absolute frozen, terror-filled stillness, pressed desperately with their backs against the cold, damp, stable wall of the main corridor, knowing all too well from the painful experience of many lost colleagues that these first drawn-out minutes after the fire was extinguished and the rock had fractured were the most deceptive, critical, and dangerous of all, for the powerful mountain, wounded deep in its very heart by the intruders, could at any unexpected moment take its revenge by sending tons of loosened, sharp stones crashing down onto their defenseless heads. The primal, almost animal fear for his own fragile life battled in young Kave's mind with the burning, powerful desire to rush forward immediately into the smoke, an urge to discover exactly what the force of fire had exposed, and that internal agonizing struggle was written on his dirty face in a mixture of stark gravity, trembling uncertainty, and wild, untamed, desperate hope.
It was precisely in that dark, tense, and uncertain moment of waiting for the thick dust to settle that the father spoke to him in a calm, low voice that resonated strangely in the cave. His deeply wrinkled face, barely visible by the faint red, slowly pulsing glow of dying embers, resembling an ancient, forgotten totem. With a tenderness unexpected in so harsh and unforgiving an environment, the older man began quietly, almost in a whisper, to spin ancient, half-mythical tales of past generations of desperate miners, of men who had centuries before struck these same hard walls with their primitive bone pickaxes, searching for that very same elusive gleaming blue that would change their sorrowful, heavy lot. He spoke with reverence of the eyes of God hidden deep within the rock, as the largest, purest lapis lazuli nodules were sometimes poetically called, reminding his son that their difficult, debilitating, and often painful work, though brutal and mud-filled, was in its deepest hidden essence a search for pure beauty and a participation in something far greater than their own short, suffering-marked lives. This brief, extraordinarily intimate and quiet moment, suspended in time and space, somewhere between the brutal, physical struggle with the rock and the inevitable specter of sudden, agonizing death beneath the rubble, forged between the weary father and the frightened son an extraordinarily strong, invisible, almost mystical bond. It gave young, exhausted Kaveh new, survival-critical mental strength and courage to face whatever lay hidden in the darkness.
When the thick smoke and suffocating stone dust finally began to slowly, heavily settle onto the uneven cave floor, the men moved cautiously, with maximum attention to every sound, back toward the working face to begin the laborious, physically devastating process of removing the weakened, cracked, and fire-damaged rock matter now covered in a thick layer of black, sticky soot. The blows of the blunted, heavy iron pickaxe against the charred, fractured granite now sounded completely different than before. The sound was much deeper, more hollow, more yielding, like striking frost-cracked wood, clearly and joyfully indicating that the brutal technique of fire and water had worked exactly as intended, weakening the structural integrity of the unyielding mountain. With each successive, exhausting blow engaging every muscle of arms and back, with each heavy fragment of scorched granite thrown aside with difficulty, the all-pervading, oppressive palette of matte, earthy hues in the mine umbra, sienna, faded yellows, and deep, dirty black, deepened by dark shadow, seemed to grow even more dominant, even more oppressive. Kaveh, breathing hard and wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty, blister-bloodied forearm, felt the exhaustion mounting with every second, his young muscles convulsed beneath the battered, rough wool from the enormous strain, and the growing, all-encompassing darkness and brutal toil seemed to swallow every hope that their several-day, murderous, sacrifice-filled labor had not been entirely in vain.
And then, suddenly, in a fraction of a second that seemed to last an eternity, the sharp iron blade struck at precisely the right perfect angle on a weakened, weathered fissure, and a massive, irregular, heavy slab of dead rock, the size of a human chest, slid with a terrifying, grinding crash to the floor, transforming in one dramatic instant the appearance of the wall and changing their bleak reality forever. The camera seemed at this moment to execute a slow, majestic, and precise push forward, closing in on the newly exposed surface, while the monotonous, near-depressive visual sequence of all-pervading browns, blacks, and grays was suddenly, brutally, without warning, torn apart and interrupted by the appearance of a color so intense, unblemished, and alive that it seemed utterly alien, unreal, and impossible in so filthy and gloomy an environment. This was no ordinary color. This was the purest, deepest, torchlight pulsating, vibrating shade of ultramarine, a raw, exposed, untouched for eons, powerful vein of the most perfect, crystalline lapis lazuli, which literally and figuratively glowed with its own inner light from within the dirty, fire-damaged rock. A macro close-up revealing every tiniest textural detail laid bare the breathtaking, otherworldly structure of the stone, its depth reminiscent of the darkest, cloudless night sky, densely and irregularly scattered with gleaming, golden, needle-sharp inclusions of pyrite that glittered and sparkled in the half-darkness like a contained, time-suspended, miniaturized, distant galaxy, drawing the gaze of both stunned miners straight into the infinite reaches of the universe. In that one quiet and magical moment of absolute revelation, all the overwhelming exhaustion that had plagued him moments before, all the throttling, animal fear of death beneath the rubble, all the enormous, unjust burden of poverty completely and irreversibly vanished, yielding in young Kavesh's mind to pure, overwhelming wonder, the most genuine fascination, and a quiet, fragile, yet incredibly powerful and all-encompassing hope. Hope that this discovered celestial stone would bring his family not only the tangible wealth and survival through the coming winter promised within it, but would also become the ultimate, irrefutable, and magnificent proof of a deeply hidden, extraordinary, majestic, and divine beauty, patiently waiting to be discovered by human beings in the darkest, deepest, most terrifying, and most inhospitable recesses of merciless nature.
Chapter 2. The Caravan of Whispers.
The air in the world-cut-off mining settlement of Sar-e-Song was saturated with dense, throat-rasping dust and an almost palpable tension when the pale morning light began to filter through the crevices in the bare rock, announcing the arrival of the critical day of departure. In the claustrophobic half-light of the caves, illuminated only by the irregularly flickering, warm glow of clay tallow lamps, a quiet, almost consecrated ritual of packing the most precious ore was taking place. The raw, irregular lumps of lapis lazuli, which in this cool light looked like fragments of deep night sky imprisoned in the brutal gray matter of stone, lay carefully displayed on rough, hand-woven woolen blankets. The camera, in slow, hypnotic macro close-ups, reveals the extraordinary crystalline structure of this legendary mineral. Golden, metallic pyrite sparks gleam boldly in the deep, impenetrable ultramarine blue, creating a dramatic, almost painful contrast with the raw, expressionless waste rock and the surrounding, all-pervading gray of the mine. Tarek, a highly experienced and respected merchant, whose face resembled parchment scoured by the merciless winds of countless dangerous journeys along the Silk Road, personally and with devout care supervised every smallest movement of his men. His gnarled, powerful hands, calloused from constant handling of leather straps and marked by the frost of high mountain passes, wrapped the precious blue stones with extraordinary delicacy in thick layers of raw linen cloth and untanned lambskin, scrupulously muffling any potentially betraying clink and entirely concealing their unique shape. This was no ordinary trade cargo. It was the concentrated blood, sweat, and hope of this entire isolated community, their absolute only guarantee of survival through the coming merciless Afghan winter that would soon lock the entire valley in ice. The most precious and largest specimens of the blue gold were laid with precision at the very bottom of extremely deep saddlebags sewn from thick cowhide, which were then deliberately covered with thick layers of common, cheap grain, sun-dried fruits, and gray, undyed wool of inferior quality, to confound any merciless desert brigands and greedy, corrupt customs officials on the trade routes.
The very departure of the caravan from the valley was a shatteringly quiet phenomenon, devoid of fanfare, yet saturated with an enormous emotional weight that seemed to press every observer into the barren earth. The women, elders, and children, their faces half hidden in the deep shadows cast by rock overhangs, stood in silence, forming a living, wordless corridor through which the laden animals passed slowly, step by step. Instead of weeping or cries of farewell, one heard only the rhythmic, dull strike of hooves against sharp, flint-strewn ground, the creaking of leather harnesses strained to their limits, and the heavy, rasping breaths of the mules that already at the very start felt the crushing weight of their burden. The camera follows this procession from the side, slowly tracking along the column, capturing microscopic details, the scattering gravel beneath the hooves, dust motes dancing in the brutally sharp rays of the rising sun cutting through the morning mist like golden spears. The color palette of the scene is dominated by raw, uncompromising earth tones, deep ochre, rusty sienna, and cool umber, which makes the awareness of the vibrating, unnaturally saturated blue hidden beneath the layers of wool into an almost physical, pulsing tension in the viewer's mind. This visual asceticism underscored the harshness of these people's existence, for whom every step beyond the secure mining enclave meant entering the domain of chaos, predators, and the merciless laws of nature, where one misstep on an icy slope could mean not only the loss of a fabulous fortune, but above all the starvation of the entire settlement that had placed its fate with trust in the hands of Tariq and his silent guards. When the caravan left the shaded valley and began its laborious ascent onto the treacherous, windswept passes of the Hindu Kush, the documentary cool narrative style yielded to a poetic, almost philosophical observation in the spirit of Terence Malick, where the immensity of nature completely swallowed the fragile human silhouettes. Long, unhurried, meandering drone shots and stabilized gimbal movements revealed the serpentine line of the caravan, a tiny, insignificant ribbon of life slowly crawling through a monumental, terrifyingly scaled landscape of jagged, snow-capped peaks and bottomless black abysses. The wind howled like a condemned soul, tearing at the edges of the heavy woolen cloaks and whipping the manes of the pack animals, while the men bowed their heads, fighting mounting oxygen deprivation and the all-encompassing, bone-deep cold that seemed to suck all warmth and will to struggle from them. The camera frequently pauses on seemingly insignificant details that deepen the sense of existential solitude, on a withered, twisted shrub desperately clinging to a bare rock, on a hawk circling high against the bleached sky, on a drop of sweat freezing on a guard's furrowed brow, creating an epic visual poem about man's struggle with the indifferent, titanic power of the mountains, where the lapis lazuli hidden in the saddlebags appears not as wealth, but as a heavy, cursed anchor. The monotony and extreme physical effort of this high-altitude crossing exerted a monstrous, destructive psychological burden on the men that became harder to bear with every day's march. In the rarefied, bracing but oxygen-poor air, each step became a fight for survival, and the surrounding landscape, scorched by the sun and frozen by night storms, seemed alien, hostile to all life, more resembling the surface of a dead planet.
In this unending, gray-brown void, the hidden ultramarine mineral was becoming in the merchants' minds something more than a raw material. It was an obsession, a phantom burden whose vibrations they seemed to sense despite layers of grain and hide, reminding them ceaselessly of the enormous risk and the unimaginable reward awaiting at the end of this ordeal.
In the evenings, when darkness fell with the brutal speed typical of high mountains, and the temperature dropped well below zero, the caravan's camp transformed into the only fragile oasis of warmth and light in the ocean of absolute black surrounding them. The campfire scenes are masterful studies in chiaroscuro, the flames casting dancing, warm reflections on the faces of men sharpened by fatigue, while their backs sink into impenetrable, ink-dark shadow in which literally anything could be lurking. In this intimate environment, protected only by the circle of fire, Tariq, breaking the long hours of forced silence, became a keeper not only of the material treasure, but of the immaterial heritage of the Silk Road, spinning in a quiet, matte voice tales of past expeditions, of caravans that had vanished without trace, swallowed by avalanches or massacred by desert nomads. His words, full of restraint but concealing a dark hidden warning, mingled with the crackle of burning dry brush and the soothing sound of ruminating mules, building an atmosphere of dense, suspended melancholy and heightening the awareness that they were nothing but a small, easily erased speck on the pages of the brutal history of these trade routes. When after many exhausting days the caravan finally began to descend from the harsh, inhospitable heights toward the vast, sun-scorched plains, nature hurled at them yet another drastically different challenge in the form of merciless, paralyzing heat. The cold, razor-sharp winds were replaced by heavy, shimmering, heat-vibrating air that distorted the horizon like a mirage, and the austere gray of the rocks gave way to an endless ocean of dunes and dusty plains in shades of intense, almost aggressive ochre and rusty sienna. The camera lens, through wide, sun-blazing frames, emphasizes this dramatic transition, recording drops of sweat running down faces and necks covered in layers of yellow dust, while the sound of sand grinding between teeth becomes an inseparable backdrop to their daily existence, deepening the sense of entrapment by a merciless, alien element. In this new, open, and shelter-stripped expanse, where there were no gorges or rock ledges to provide shadow or a hiding place, the awareness of the carried wealth began to take the form of a deep, paralyzing paranoia that penetrated like poison into the minds of all the guards, who, with each step, felt increasingly naked and defenseless on the great desert chessboard. It was on these open spaces that night became their greatest enemy, and every shift in the wind's direction, every rustle of sand or sound of a desert fox slipping through the darkness was instantly interpreted by exhausted, overstimulated minds as a signal of approaching inevitable bandit attack. The visual narrative enters here the realm of near psychological thriller. Extremely slow camera advances on the taut silhouettes of sentinels, close-ups on hands nervously tightening around the hilts of daggers and curved swords, eyes restlessly roaming in the darkness, all perfectly conveying the growing, stifling tension and the physical pain of unceasing anticipation of a strike from nowhere. The ubiquitous silence of the desert was not soothing. It was dense, electrically charged, and heavy with the suppressed breathing of dozens of men who unconsciously prepared themselves for the moment when their sacred mission would erupt into chaotic, bloody carnage in defense of the blue stones that had suddenly begun to weigh upon them more than anvils. The culmination of this unbearable tension was one specific moonless night during which absolute pitch-black darkness caused the caravan to halt in a state of near catatonic terror, believing itself silently surrounded by an invisible enemy whose presence seemed palpable in the fear-laden air. The scene is a masterpiece of building dread through minimalism. The complete absence of background music forces the viewer to focus on microscopic ambient sounds, the faint creaking of leather, Tariq's shallow, broken breathing, a single drop of sweat striking dry earth, while in the absolute darkness, lit only by the dying, red-glowing embers of the fire, the guards remained in total, motionless stillness, with drawn weapons and hearts hammering like mad bells.
When dawn finally broke and the first gray rays of the sun brutally tore aside the curtain of darkness, revealing only empty, wind-rippled seas of dead sand and stone, the collective sigh of relief that swept through the camp was almost as loud as the cracking of a glacier. It turned out that the alleged attackers had been nothing but an illusion, a fata morgana born of extreme exhaustion, dehydration, and monstrous psychological stress, or perhaps a pack of emaciated wild dogs that slipped silently along the edge of their perception in search of food scraps, leaving behind only fear. Yet this relief was extraordinarily bitter and suffused with deep exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained them in a state of the highest combat readiness through the entire night suddenly collapsed, leaving the men with trembling muscles, empty gazes, and a complete absence of strength for further marching. Morning preparations for the road took place in absolute heavy silence, and the camera, in the style of a detached, slow documentarian, recorded their slowed, almost mechanical movements, showing with painful exactness the destroyed footwear, lips cracked to bleeding, and gazes desperately searching the horizon for even the shadow of hope that this ordeal was nearing its end.
The final stage of this exhausting journey resembled a march of shadows, the rhythmic, dull tread of spent animals and the quiet shuffling of tattered feet on hard, sun-scorched earth, marking the monotonous rhythm of a slow approach to the longed-for salvation that still seemed nothing but an illusion, an unattainable mirage on the edge of the world. Yet the landscape, at first imperceptibly, then with growing visible relief, began to undergo subtle, gentle transformations. The harsh, dead sand gradually yielded to clumps of green, wiry vegetation. A first delicate scent of moisture appeared in the air, suggesting the presence of underground springs, and the earth began to betray clear signs of human intervention in the form of beaten paths and primitive irrigation systems pumping life into the barren soil. These microscopic signs of civilization acted upon the exhausted merchants like water on a sun-scorched sponge, pouring into their tormented bodies the last reserves of determination and releasing a spark of feverish, growing anticipation that began to replace the previous debilitating paranoia and fear. The final spectacular scene of this murderous crossing unfolds in the magical, time-suspended light of the golden hour, when the descending enormous sun stains the dust rising above the trade road an intense, burning shade of aged honey and copper, lending the entire world an aura of extraordinary, almost sacred sublimity. From behind the last sandy rise, like a great gleaming ship emerging from thick fog, the panorama of a great Persian city unfolded before them, a powerful, life-pulsing heart of trade whose horizon was studded with proudly rising minarets and enormous geometric mosque domes gleaming in the sunset light with tiny fragments of colored ceramic.
This striking collision of the wild, merciless nature from which they had just escaped with their lives and the refined, monumental architecture of Eastern civilization brought with it an immense, almost physical sense of relief, finally ending the period of terrible tension and opening a new, fascinating chapter in the extraordinary odyssey of the lapis lazuli, which, after weeks of darkness in raw saddlebags, was about to be drawn out and presented to the world in the full, stunning power of its vibrating royal blue.
Chapter 3. The Price of Blue in Persia.
The transition from the unforgiving, sun-bleached expanse of the Persian desert to the looming silhouette of Tabriz was not merely a change in geography. It was a profound shift in the very fabric of reality for the weary caravan. For weeks, Tariq's world had been defined by the brutal, blinding white light of the high altitudes, the monotonous rhythm of camel hooves striking barren rock, and the ever-present, biting wind that tasted of dust and ancient ice. Now, as the sprawling metropolis materialized from the heat haze like a mirage made solid, the air grew thick, heavy with the complex, intoxicating breath of 100,000 souls and their myriad endeavors. The cinematic tracking shot of their approach would capture the deep, exhausted grooves etched into the faces of the cameleers, their skin textured like weathered saddle leather, coated in a fine layer of pale, calcified dust that muted their features into anonymous masks of endurance. Against the muted, monochromatic earth tones of the surrounding landscape, endless washes of ochre, dry umber, and bleached sienna, the distant city walls of Tabriz rose as a formidable barrier, their mud-brick battlements catching the dramatic, low-angled light of the late afternoon sun. This light, harsh and golden, carved deep shadows into the architectural crevices, echoing the chiaroscuro intensity of a Caravaggio painting. As they drew closer, the immense chaotic hum of the city swelled into an audible physical force, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate within the hollows of their tired bones. Tariq, riding at the head of the procession, felt the heavy, burdensome weight of the leather satchels resting against his thigh, the concentrated fortune of raw lapis lazuli secured within. The weary relief of having survived the treacherous mountain passes warred with a sudden, sharp spike of calculated shrewdness. The journey of survival was ending, but the infinitely more complex journey of commerce was only just beginning, and within those towering walls lay the crucible where the true value of their suffering would be forged. Passing through the monumental gates of Tabriz was akin to being swallowed whole by a living, breathing leviathan of commerce, an overwhelming sensory assault that immediately sought to disorient the uninitiated traveler. The sheer scale of the auditory landscape was staggering, the violent clatter of wooden cartwheels on irregular cobblestones, the aggressive guttural shouts of drovers clearing a path through the dense throng, the rhythmic, metallic clangor of blacksmiths hammering red-hot iron in the outer wards, and the overlapping polyphonic symphony of a dozen different dialects echoing off the soaring, vaulted brick ceilings. The camera, moving in a slow, deliberate, almost reverent glide, would capture the microscopic details of this chaotic threshold. The sudden, startling flash of a merchant's silk robe, a deep, bruised purple cutting through the haze of pulverized dung and wood smoke, the viscous amber drip of raw pine resin being unloaded from a fractured wooden crate, the hyper-detailed texture of rough-spun wool garments brushing against polished bronze vessels. The light here was a fractured mosaic, piercing through the narrow apertures of the roof in intense, moted beams that illuminated swirling constellations of dust, while leaving the deep alcoves and alleyways in impenetrable velvety darkness. It was an environment of profound contrast, where extreme wealth brushed shoulders with desperate poverty.
Tariq's senses, honed to a razor edge by the stark emptiness of the mountains, were suddenly bombarded by the heavy, cloying sense of roasting mutton fat, sharp cardamom, the metallic tang of fresh blood from the butcher's stalls, and the underlying, inescapable stench of concentrated humanity. He pulled his woven wool scarf tighter around his face, not merely to filter the thick, particulate-laden air, but to mask his own expression.
At last, Tariq located the specific, unassuming archway that marked the entrance to the caravanserai of the gem merchants, a secluded courtyard separated from the frenetic main arteries of the bazaar by thick, sound-dampening walls of baked earth and heavy, iron-studded timber doors. Stepping across the threshold was like passing through an invisible membrane into an entirely different dimension. The violent cacophony of the outer market was instantly muted to a low, distant murmur, replaced by the tranquil, rhythmic splashing of a central marble fountain and the soft, hushed murmurs of men engaged in the most serious of conversations. The light within this inner sanctum was different, softer, more diffused, filtered through intricately carved wooden lattices that cast complex, mesmerizing patterns of light and shadow across the tiled floors. Tariq instructed his men to secure the exhausted camels in the lower stalls, personally detaching the heavy, unremarkable leather saddlebags that contained his life's work and carrying them with a deceptive, practiced casualness. He made his way toward the raised, elegantly carpeted alcove of Farhad, a man renowned throughout the Silk Road as the premier conduit for the finest stones destined for the insatiable, wealth-gorged maritime republic of Venice. The visual aesthetic here would lean heavily into the opulent textures of historical reality, the plush, yielding pile of the Kashan rugs beneath Tariq's dusty boots, the rich, deep crimson velvet of the cushions, and the delicate, translucent fragility of the porcelain tea bowls arranged on a low, hammered brass tray. Farhad himself was a study in calculated wealth, his garments tailored from the finest, softest silks, his beard meticulously oiled, his eyes dark, unreadable pools of obsidian that betrayed absolutely nothing as he watched the rugged, mountain-worn Afghan merchant approach. The initial exchange of greetings was a slow, elaborate dance of formal Persian pleasantries, an intricate ritual of respect and veiled intent where both men measured the other's spiritual and financial fortitude before a single word of business was ever spoken. Before the leather satchels were even acknowledged, the deeply ingrained cultural machinery of the Persian tea ritual had to run its unhurried, necessary course, serving as a vital psychological buffer and a sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. A silent, barefoot servant materialized from the deep shadows, bearing a silver samovar that hissed and spit a delicate plume of white steam into the cool, shadowed air of the alcove. The camera would focus on the extreme, macro-level details of this process, elevating the mundane to the realm of high art, the viscous, amber-colored liquid cascading from the elegantly curved silver spout, the precise, slow-motion splash as it hit the bottom of the fragile, gold-rimmed glass cup, the slow dissolution of a crystalline cube of raw sugar as it sank to the bottom. Farhad spoke in a low, resonant baritone, his words carefully chosen, inquiring about the treacherous weather in the Hindu Kush, the movement of nomadic bandit tribes along the northern routes, and the current political stability of the mountain warlords. Tariq answered with equal care, his voice rough and gravelly from the dry desert air, offering just enough information to prove his legitimacy and the arduous nature of his journey, while carefully concealing the exact location of the hidden blue veins from which his cargo was extracted. This polite conversation, layered with profound subtext, was the crucial pre-negotiation phase, a delicate probing of defenses. Farhad was attempting to gauge Tariq's desperation, whether the merchant was starved for immediate silver to pay off angry cameleers, or if he possessed the cold, hard patience of a man who knew the incomparable rarity of his goods.
Tariq, in turn, watched the microscopic twitches of Farhad's perfectly manicured hands, the slight...
The silence was finally broken by Farhad, his voice returning to its smooth, controlled resonance, though it now carried a sharper, more metallic edge as the intricate, ritualistic dance of the haggling commenced. "It is an acceptable yield," Farhad murmured, an immense, calculated understatement designed to establish a psychological baseline of indifference as he gently placed the magnificent stone back onto the raw wool. "The color is fair, though the calcite veins are perhaps a fraction more prominent than the discriminating buyers of the Republic prefer. They require a purity that this mountain rock struggles to provide." Tariq did not flinch, his face remaining a rigid mask of weather-beaten stone, for he knew the script of this ancient theatrical performance perfectly. "If the masters of Venice find the blue of the Afghan sky lacking, perhaps they should attempt to grind the sea into their paint pots," Tariq replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that filled the shadowed alcove. "This stone was pulled from the belly of the world, where the air freezes a man's breath in his throat. It is the blood of the mountain, pure and undeniable. There is no finer lazuli on the entire length of the Silk Road, and your eyes, Farhad, are far too sharp to pretend otherwise." Thus began the elaborate battle of wits and wills, a complex volley of offers and counter-offers, where numbers were never spoken directly at first, but alluded to through abstract comparisons to the price of silk, the weight of saffron, and the cost of maintaining armed guards against the mountain warlords. It was a game of strategic retreats and aggressive advancements, filled with theatrical sighs of disappointment, feigned insults, and sudden, intense periods of profound silence. The camera would capture the subtle shiftings of bodies, the tension in the hands, the way the light played across the deep blue stones that sat silently between them as the ultimate prize, the silent witness to this desperate struggle for margin, profit, and survival. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, stretching across the ornate Kashan rugs and deepening the chiaroscuro effect within the alcove, the negotiation escalated, moving from abstract philosophy to the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of silver and weight. Farhad introduced the complexities of the onward journey, eloquently detailing the exorbitant tariffs levied by the Ottoman tax collectors, the immense risks of piracy on the Mediterranean crossing to Italy, and the unpredictable, fickle nature of the Venetian artists' guilds, all in an attempt to relentlessly drive the purchase price down. Tariq countered with equal ferocity, citing the devastating loss of camels on the icy mountain passes, the extortionate bribes demanded by the tribal chieftains who controlled the valleys leading out of Badakhshan, and the simple, undeniable fact that without his perilous labor, the grand cathedrals of Europe would remain utterly devoid of the divine, celestial blue they so desperately craved. The air grew thick with unspoken threats of walking away, of seeking out rival dealers in the lower bazaar, though both men intimately knew that a union between this specific cargo and this specific buyer was inevitable. It was merely a question of where the blade of the final price would fall. The visual focus would hone in on the microscopic details of their interaction, a single bead of sweat tracing a slow, glistening path down Tariq's dust-caked temple, the tightening grip of Farhad's fingers on his prayer beads, the rhythmic clicking of the polished wooden spheres accelerating as the margins grew agonizingly thin, the way the ambient light caught the golden flecks of pyrite in the lapis, making the stones appear as if they were quietly burning from within. It was a high-stakes psychological war of attrition, demanding absolute emotional control, where the first man to show true desperation or greed would instantly forfeit his advantage.
As Tariq stepped out of the secluded, quiet caravanserai and back into the overwhelming sensory maelstrom of the Tabriz Bazaar, the heavy weight of the silver in his satchels felt fundamentally different than the weight of the stone he had carried. It was the weight of conclusion, of a heavy burden finally laid to rest.
He paused in the shadows of the archway, adjusting the thick wool scarf around his face, allowing himself one brief, solitary moment to breathe in the complex, intoxicating scent of spices and smoke, the adrenaline of the successful transaction slowly bleeding out of his weary muscles. Behind him, in the impenetrable Caravaggio-esque gloom of Farhad's inner sanctum, the raw lapis lazuli was already being prepared for the next infinitely perilous leg of its extraordinary migration. The stones, torn from the dark, freezing heart of the Afghan mountains, were now destined to travel across vast, scorching deserts, traverse hostile empires, and cross the turbulent, storm-tossed waters of the Mediterranean Sea. They would be handed from heavily armed caravan guards to ruthless galley captains, and eventually delivered into the secretive, alchemical workshops of the Italian Renaissance. There, under the brilliant sun-drenched skies of Venice, these rough primordial rocks would be systematically pulverized, purified, and transformed into the most expensive, sought-after substance in the known world, the legendary pigment, ultramarine. The stark, breathtaking visual contrast from the chaotic, dusty, earth-toned reality of the Persian bazaar to the pristine, luminous blue cloaks of the Virgin Mary painted on the grand canvases of Europe was inextricably linked by this specific moment, this specific transaction in the shadows. Tariq merged seamlessly back into the ceaseless flow of humanity, a solitary merchant disappearing into the chaotic tapestry of history, having unknowingly served as the crucial, bloody catalyst for the greatest masterpieces of the Western world. The departure of Tariq from the immediate vicinity of Farhad's stall did not mark the end of the energy generated by their monumental transaction. Rather, it sent invisible ripples outward through the highly sensitive, interconnected web of the Tabriz mercantile community. In the highly claustrophobic, intensely observant world of the bazaar, true secrets were an absolute impossibility. Every movement of heavy goods, every unusually long meeting behind closed wooden lattices, and the subtle changing weight of a merchant's gait as he departed a courtyard were meticulously logged by 1,000 watching eyes. Farhad, remaining in the cool rosewater-scented darkness of his sanctum, immediately began dictating encrypted missives to his network of Venetian intermediaries in the Levant, his voice low and urgent as he detailed the acquisition of an exceptionally pure, massive yield of the coveted blue stone. The cinematic portrayal of this aftermath would intercut between the extreme macro-level detailing of Farhad's calligrapher, the sharp scrape of the reed pen, the viscous spread of the iron gall ink across the rough, fibrous texture of the parchment, and the wide, sweeping, chaotic tracking shots of Tariq navigating his way back to his waiting caravan. The atmosphere was thick with the residue of high-stakes commerce, a palpable lingering electrical charge that hummed in the spaces between the vaulted brick arches. This single exchange of silver for stone would fund regional mountain wars, enrich ambitious maritime republics, and ultimately dictate the precise hue of divine grace in cathedrals thousands of miles away. It was a profound testament to the sprawling, unseen power of the ancient trade routes, where the sheer, unyielding desire for beauty, manifested in the perfect, impossible shade of ultramarine blue, possessed the gravitational force to drag raw, jagged earth across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the known world, forever binding the...
Chapter 4. The Sea of Venice.
The air in the Levantine port, somewhere at the meeting point of ancient Antioch and the teeming life of Aleppo, shimmered with murderous heat, conjuring wavering mirages above the sun-baked, trodden earth. The camera in close-up captures dust motes dancing in oblique shafts of light that struggle to penetrate the holy canvas awnings of the caravanserai, creating an effect reminiscent of the most dramatic canvases of Caravaggio.
The visual aesthetic of this place is the absolute triumph of raw, earthy tonalities. Everywhere dominates yellowish ochre, burnt sienna, and deep, dark umber of sun-dried bricks that have absorbed sunlight for centuries. In this stifling, claustrophobic labyrinth of courtyards and corridors, the Persian camel caravan heralds the end of the first epic stage of the precious cargo's journey, which has traveled thousands of miles from the Afghan mountains. The animals, covered in a thick layer of desert dust, breathe heavily, and their rough, matte fur contrasts with skin gleaming with sweat, all captured by the camera lens with the hyper-realistic precision of documentary film. Macro photography focuses on details: cracked, aged hide of the pack saddles, rusted iron clasps, and rough woolen ropes that for endless months have withstood sandstorms and the harsh, merciless sun of Central Asia. In this merciless, austere world, where every sound seems muffled by ubiquitous dust and heat, the Persian merchant network, operating in shadow and secrecy, hands its most precious treasure to the new owners from the West. It is here, in a setting woven from deep shadows and blinding radiance, that the famous lapis lazuli prepares for its final departure from the Asian continent. The cacophony of the port, guttural shouts of drovers, the bellowing of camels, the rhythmic clink of coins being counted, forms a fascinating symphony of human greed and determination, at whose center sits an unassuming, enormously heavy crate, concealing within it a blue that jaded, beauty-hungry Europe has not yet had the chance to fully experience upon its altars and canvases.
The days at sea on the unfriendly Mediterranean slowly blurred into one unbroken and monotonous sequence of events dictated by the merciless rhythm of oars striking the water's surface and the creaking of taut ropes that in the sunlight resembled the dried sinews of some enormous sea creature. A tremendous, suffocating heat poured from the cloudless sky in streams of liquid gold, heating the wooden deck of the galley to the point where walking on it barefoot caused genuine burning pain, a reminder of nature's cruelty and human helplessness in the middle of the ocean. But one afternoon, in an atmosphere of sudden and ominous air thickening, atmospheric pressure dropped sharply, and the sailor's skin broke into cold sweat of anticipation, foretelling the arrival of something far more menacing than the previous heat and monotony. The camera, using techniques close to Malik's slow takes, slowly lifts toward the horizon, where dark, lead-heavy clouds had begun ominously to gather. They looked like bruises on the clear, blue until now, body of the sky, swallowing the last traces of golden light. The wind suddenly changed direction and intensity, growing cold and piercing, its keening through the sails, resembling the moans of mighty mythical beasts. The water around the ship lost its translucent gleam and took on the dark, almost black color of congealed blood and tar. In this dramatic shift of scene, dominated by an approaching chiaroscuro, where bright wave reflections contrasted with an ink-dark sky, the crew began to prepare for the worst, knowing that the rage of the Mediterranean could within moments destroy weeks of their hard labor and bury the ultramarinus forever in the ocean depths. And then the storm arrived, violent, merciless, and terrifying in its destructive fury, transforming the tranquil voyage into a battle for survival drawn straight from apocalyptic Renaissance nightmares. Niccolo, consumed by absolute terror, thought not of his own life. His only obsessive goal was to reach the hold, where the crates of Barakshan stone lay submerged in water and utter darkness, representing the key to his entire future.
Chapter 5. The Alchemist of Cannaregio.
The fog enveloping Venice on that cool autumn morning was thick as unspun wool. muffling every sound and transforming the teeming city into a spectral, dreamy vision in which the outlines of buildings dissolved like watercolors on damp paper. The camera slowly, with almost devout celebration, follows the movement of a slender black gondola that soundlessly cuts the oily, dark green surface of the canals, heading toward the northern reaches of the city, toward the isolated and mystery-shrouded district of Cannaregio. On the prow of the boat, wrapped in a heavy velvet cloak, whose texture seems to absorb the pervasive moisture, sits Niccolò, a young, ambitious agent of Venice's most powerful art patrons. His hands, white-knuckled on the iron fittings of massive wooden crates, betray enormous nervous tension, for the cargo he guards is more precious than gold from the New World. In those heavy oak containers rests raw lapis lazuli, the blue stone from the distant, inaccessible mountains of Afghanistan, which has only just arrived at port after months of dangerous travel. Macro-photography close-ups show droplets of dense fog settling on the rusting metal of padlocks and damp wood, emphasizing the physical weight and rawness of the matter about to undergo transformation. The sound of the oar striking water seems unnaturally loud in this dead silence, building a slow but inexorable emotional tension that draws us from the sphere of brutal commercial trade to the antechamber of genuine magic. The gondola at last draws up to the slippery, dark algae-covered stone steps leading to an unassuming pair of heavy raw wood doors, behind which lies the workshop of one of the most mysterious craftsmen in all the Republic, a man who is no ordinary merchant, but a true alchemist of color.
Chapter 6. The Paste of Life. The light in Gaspar's workshop was like a living, breathing entity, creeping along the raw stone walls and sculpting space in a manner worthy of Caravaggio's own brush. The camera, moving at a slow, meditative pace on a precision gimbal, reveals darkness dispersed only by strategically placed sources of warm light filtering through narrow shutters. At the heart of this shadow, on a thick oak table, rests a bowl filled with lapis lazuli ground to fine dust. Macro photography now reveals what the naked eye cannot perceive. This is not simply blue powder. It is a complex, microscopic landscape full of geological contrasts. We see the sharp, crystalline structures of blue lazurite gleaming with an inner, almost otherworldly power, neighboring matte, gray calcite nodules resembling dead, ashen earth. Between them, like scattered stars in a miniature cosmos, gold pyrite particles glitter and spark. This hypnotic, slow sequence builds an atmosphere of devout reverence and deep fascination with the process. Gaspar and his apprentices, dressed in authentic rough woolen tunics and leather aprons bearing the traces of countless hours of labor, stand around the table in complete silence. Their faces, lit sharply from the side, express concentration and an awareness of the gravity of the approaching moment. It is now, in this quiet space steeped in the smell of dust and minerals, that the most critical and magical stage of the entire ultramarine extraction process is to begin, the creation of the alchemical paste that will separate light from darkness, pure blue from useless rock. The preparation for this act resembles a religious ceremony where every gesture is deliberate and every gaze carries the weight of centuries of craft tradition. Before the grains of stone can become pigment, they must be tested in an organic crucible, and Gaspar, as master of the ceremony, prepares to initiate this consecrated act of striking matter, while the camera lens records with fascination every dust mote dancing in a shaft of sunlight.
Chapter 7. Washing the Dross.
The heavy, pregnant silence of the digestion room hung in the air like a physical weight, a thick, almost impenetrable tapestry woven from dancing dust motes and the pungent, unmistakable scent of aged pine resin, melting beeswax, and damp, ancient earth. For weeks, the alchemical dough had rested in the darkest corners of the shadows, a dormant, mysterious chrysalis holding within its ugly, dark, impenetrable mass the singular promise of celestial beauty, sequestered away in a secluded corner of the workshop where the light of day barely dared to reach. This space, a veritable sanctuary of slow, deliberate transformation, was illuminated only by the harsh, dramatic shafts of afternoon sunlight that pierced the narrow, high windows, casting deep, Caravaggio-esque shadows that swallowed the rough-hewn corners of the room and brilliantly highlighted the uneven, textured surfaces of the cold stone walls and the worn, heavy oak of the master's workbench. Niccolo, the young and eager apprentice, stood tentatively near the arched doorway, his posture stiff with a complex mixture of enduring patience and gnawing, persistent doubt, his wide eyes fixed unblinkingly on the linen-wrapped bundle that looked profoundly more like a discarded lump of muddy refuse than the legendary source of the most precious and coveted pigment in the known world. He wore a simple tunic of rough-spun wool, the coarse fibers itchy and unforgiving against his skin, dyed a humble, muted umber that perfectly camouflaged his slender frame within the earthy, subdued tones of the traditional workshop. His master, Gaspar, moved with the slow, deliberate, and reverent grace of a high priest preparing for a sacred ancient rite, his heavy leather apron creaking softly with each measured step, the worn, heavily stained material serving as a visual testament to decades of wrestling with recalcitrant materials and unforgiving elements. The very air of the room was thick, practically vibrating with anticipation, representing the glorious culmination of the lengthy digestion period where the raw, painstakingly pulverized lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan had been intimately and violently bound with the sticky, forgiving embrace of the pastilles, the aromatic mastic, and the golden wax. To Niccolo's untrained, anxious, and highly logical mind, the entire process seemed precariously closer to madness, superstition, or dark magic than rational, predictable craftsmanship, requiring a blind, unwavering faith that this foul-smelling, greasy, unappealing concoction could ever possibly yield the luminous, divine, and heavenly blue that adorned the sacred robes of the Virgin Mary in the greatest cathedrals. Yet Gaspar's heavily weathered face, dramatically illuminated by a stark, singular beam of golden light, betrayed absolutely no such uncertainty or hesitation. His stoic expression was one of profound, unshakable confidence, portraying a seasoned man who had walked this exact, treacherous path 100 times before and knew exactly the miraculous, breathtaking destination that awaited them at the bitter end of this arduous journey. The silence stretched endlessly, amplifying the subtle sound of Gaspar's steady breathing and the microscopic shifting of the dust suspended in the air, creating a breathtaking cinematic tableau of pure expectation, a perfectly suspended moment in time just before the grand, undeniable revelation of the secret chemistry that would very soon bleed its breathtaking, colorful truth into the eagerly waiting world. Gaspar finally approached the sturdy, heavily scarred oak workbench, his large, calloused, and pigment-stained hands reaching out with profound deliberation to claim the resting dough, the very focal point of their endless weeks of silent, patient, and grueling labor. The unwrapping of the rested dough ball was not merely a physical action, but a deeply ceremonial act performed with a quiet reverence that sharply
Chapter 8. A Powder Weighed Against Gold. The silence that descended on Gaspar's Venetian workshop was not an ordinary absence of sound. It was a dense, palpable substance resembling liquid resin in which time inexorably congealed. In the deep half-darkness of the room, illuminated only by a narrow, oblique shaft of sharp light pressing through the slender crack of partly opened shutters, dust particles danced their slow, hypnotic ballet, like microscopic galaxies suspended in the infinite void of the cosmos. At the very heart of this dramatic chiaroscuro, so reminiscent of the masterful canvases upon which the final product of their months of torment would soon rest, a row of wide clay vessels sat waiting. They were filled with a murky, nostril-stinging lye solution in which, slowly, with an almost painful geological heaviness and majesty, invisible to the naked eye crystals of the purest lazurite sank to the very bottom. This critical production stage demanded absolute, unshakable patience, a virtue as rare in feverish, commerce-swept Venice as the blue stone itself brought from the distant, inaccessible mountains of Sar-e-Sang. Every passing hour of waiting was like a held breath, and the heavy air of the workshop was saturated with the intense historical smell of rancid fat, melting beeswax, and the sharp metallic scent of soda that for long days consumed impurities, releasing from the hard grip of the stone its purest essence. Gaspar, the old master of color alchemy, his hands furrowed with deep scars from corrosive acids and dried resins, sat motionless on a plain wooden stool, staring at the still surface of the liquid with the devout concentration of a priest keeping vigil over the most sacred relic. He knew perfectly well that in this murky, unremarkable water, the final transcendental act of transmutation was now taking place, where the brutal, earthly stone torn from the entrails of Afghan peaks by iron pickaxes was transforming into ethereal dust, into pure light imprisoned within the structure of matter. In this infinitely slow settling of the blue sediment lay the entire fundamental philosophy of their craft, the merciless rejection of what is superfluous, the washing away of all-pervading gray, of treacherously gleaming pyrite and worthless calcite, so that at the very bottom only the absolute, unblemished, and perfect might remain.
Chapter 9. The Patron's Decree.
The camera moves slowly with devout reverence, as in the longest, most meditative takes of Terrence Malick's films, along the monumental, awe-inspiring facade of a Roman palazzo, leaving behind the bustle, dust, and brutal mercantile prose of life that has dominated our story of trade routes until now. We are in Rome at the beginning of the 16th century, at the very epicenter of Renaissance power, political intrigue, and unrestrained human ambition, where art is not merely an aesthetic whim, a decoration, or an expression of personal sensibility, but the most powerful and carefully calculated instrument of political and religious propaganda. The transition from the crowded, muddy, shout-filled marketplaces of Venice, Genoa, or Florence to the cool marble tranquility of this place is striking, producing an almost physical cognitive shock, as though we had crossed the boundary between the world of profane life and the sphere of absolute sacredness joined to absolute power. The sharp, early Roman sun mercilessly sculpts deep, dramatic shadows on Corinthian pilasters, carved cornices, and the intricately wrought iron window grills, heralding a visual narrative style deeply inspired by the stark, unsettling realism and uncompromising contrasts of Caravaggio's paintings. We cross the heavy, bronze-fitted oak portal, and the streets clamor. Cries of vendors, the clatter of horses' hooves, the calls of craftsmen instantly dies, brutally cut off by the thickness of the ancient walls, yielding to an absolute, overwhelming silence that is the attribute of true power, broken only by the rhythmic, tension-amplifying echo of our own footsteps on the magnificent, geometric floor of blood-red porphyry and deep green serpentine.
Chapter 10. The Master's Studio.
The camera, guided with an unhurried, almost hypnotic fluency, reminiscent of the slow breathing of a sleeping giant, plunges into the dense gloom of Master Raphael Santi's Roman workshop like an intruder entering a sacred world-hidden sanctuary of art, where time is measured not by the strokes of a clock, but by the slow, methodical rhythm of human, artisanal labor. This interior, drowning in a dramatic, fathomless chiaroscuro, evoking the still unpainted, brilliant canvases of Caravaggio, is an absolute masterpiece of visual composition, in which darkness is not merely an absence of light, but an almost palpable, dense substance from which individual silhouettes and objects emerge with difficulty. A narrow, oblique stream of sharp afternoon sunlight forces its way through a high, barred window, cutting the smoke-dense, heavy air like a heated golden sword, illuminating millions of microscopic dust particles, whirling in the space like an isolated microcosm suspended in infinite void. In this sharp, almost theatrical beam of light, the workshop's color palette reveals itself in its full, raw glory, absolutely dominated by deep, earthy tones that form the foundation of Renaissance painting: burnt sienna, saturated rusty ochre, cool dark umber, and tarry bone black, all having settled in thick layers on every available surface, from the heavy oak tables to the uneven stone floor. The camera, in a smooth ring movement, slowly sweeps the silhouettes of apprentices and young students who form the beating, living heart of this artistic hive, their focused faces, sweat-drenched and paint-smeared, reflecting the flickering glow of burning hearths and wax candles. They are dressed in garments whose texture and materiality shout raw authenticity from the screen, macro photography relentlessly exposing the roughness of the coarse, undyed wool of their tunics and the oil-burnished, edge-worn leather aprons that are the distinctive armor of these young alchemists of art.
Chapter 11. Binding Light to Oil.
The master's workshop drowned in deep, almost palpable shadows, foreshadowing the dramatic realism of Baroque painting that would define the decades ahead, sculpting space through uncompromising contrasts. The morning light of Rome, sharp and piercing, penetrated a high, arched window, cutting the dark interior like a golden, immaterial spear that drew from the half-darkness millions of swirling dust motes dancing in the air like miniature, chaotic constellations in the artist's private microcosm. The smell of the room was dense, suspended, and saturated with centuries of craft tradition, steeped in the sharp aroma of distilled turpentine, the sweetish scent of melting beeswax, the raw smell of canvas stretched onto frames, and the earthy breath of drying wood. At the very center of this beam of light, like the central altar in a forgotten ancient temple dedicated to art, rose a massive oak easel, upon which rested a wooden panel prepared with the utmost care. The foundational layers of the monumental painting were almost completely finished, forming a complex, multi-layered narrative structure. The background, built from subtle, soft transitions of burnt umber and raw sienna, provided a solid, earth-rooted frame for the entire composition. The flesh tones of the figures, applied in layers with Venetian precision and Florentine rigor, radiated a hidden warmth, creating the impression that warm, living blood pulsed beneath the parchment-thin, delicately veined skin. Smaller secondary draperies and costume elements displayed muted, deep reds and dark copper greens, which, despite their richness, had no right to compete with what was yet to come. At the very heart of this carefully composed symphony of colors, shapes, and shadows, there gaped a striking, almost blindingly pure void, a vast area designated for the robe of the Virgin Mary, left deliberately in the immaculate, raw white of a carefully smoothed lead-white underpainting.
Chapter 12.
The Virgin's Mantle.
The air in the master's Roman workshop was dense with the suspended smell of turpentine, heated walnut oil, melting pine resin, and raw, weathering plaster, creating a unique, almost sacred atmosphere of a place where matter became spirit, and ordinary craft was transformed into the highest form of art. The sunlight entering through the tall north-facing window was sharp, yet diffused by linen curtains, laying on the floor in long geometric strips of white and gray, as in the dramatic compositions of Caravaggio, where deep, almost impenetrable darkness contrasts with the blinding brightness of revelation. All the assistants and students, from the youngest boy grinding pigments to the most experienced journeyman, froze in motionless stillness, their breaths growing shallow and their movements slow, as though fearing that the slightest disturbance of the air might disrupt their teacher's absolute concentration. The dominant color palette in the room was based on raw, earthy tones, ochre walls, burnt sienna covering the oak easels, umber of the work clothes, and deep browns of old wood, forming a deliberate, almost philosophical backdrop for the miracle about to occur upon the prepared panel. From the perspective of a slow camera advance, reminiscent of the hypnotic, contemplative takes of Terrence Malick's films, we see every dust mote dancing in a shaft of light, every grain in a wooden floor, every weave of the master's rough woolen tunic, as he stood in silence before his work, preparing for the ultimate act, the act of creation. This was the silence before the storm, but a storm not of destruction, but of creation, the moment in which all the sweat, labor, and capital accumulated over months was about to be crystallized in one decisive stroke of the brush. The brush of the finest Kolinsky fur waited on the edge of the palette, and in Raphael's mind the entire composition, until now merely sketched in forms and shadows, was beginning to vibrate with pulsing life, demanding the final breath that was a color born in the darkness of Afghan caves, and now about to clothe the shoulders of the Mother of God herself. Chapter 13. The Unveiling.
The atmosphere within the cardinal's private chapel before the unveiling was a dense, suffocating tapestry of profound silence and almost unbearable anticipation, a psychological pressure cooker contained within walls of ancient cold stone. The space was an architectural marvel of the high Renaissance, yet in this pre-dawn gloom it felt like a primordial cavern deeply entrenched in the earthy, foundational tones of human existence. The ambient light was scarce, provided only by dozens of thick, handcrafted beeswax candles that flickered with a hesitant, rhythmic pulse, casting long, wavering Caravaggio-esque shadows that danced across the rough-hewn travertine and the polished marble pilasters. The air itself possessed a tangible weight, heavy with the accumulated sense of centuries of fervent prayers, the metallic tang of damp masonry, and the rich, intoxicating aroma of burning frankincense that hung in the air like a ghostly fog. This was a space dominated by the raw, unyielding colors of the earth, deep, resonant burnt umbers, the warm, baked clay hues of raw sienna, and the oppressive, light-absorbing blacks of the deepest recesses of the sanctuary. The motes of dust, disturbed by the subtle shifting of the gathered crowd, floated lazily through the dark air, occasionally catching the weak, warm glow of the candlelight, appearing as microscopic transient constellations in a vast dark universe. Every breath drawn by the attendees seemed amplified. Every subtle shifting of weight on the warm stone floor echoed with the gravity of the impending revelation. The chapel was a womb of expectation, a physical manifestation of the collective anxiety and profound hope of the powerful men who had gathered in the dimness, waiting for a singular moment that promised to redefine their understanding of beauty, piety, and the sheer limits of human artistic achievement. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the chapel groaned with an agonizing, drawn-out creak of ancient wrought-iron hinges, a sound that sliced through the heavy silence and signaled the beginning of the meticulously orchestrated procession. The cardinal, the supreme architect of this entire endeavor, entered the sanctuary with the slow, deliberate, and impossibly smooth gait of a man who fully understood the theatrical gravity of his own existence. His physical presence was a masterclass in the display of ultimate, unchallenged authority, clad in garments that were themselves a testament to the staggering wealth and intricate logistical networks of the church. He wore a sweeping capa magna of the most exquisite, heavy crimson velvet, a fabric woven with painstaking care in the finest looms of Florence and dyed to an impossibly deep, blood-red hue using countless thousands of crushed cochineal insects, an earthy, visceral color that absorbed the weak candlelight and seemed to radiate its own internal formidable heat. Beneath the velvet, the crisp, stark white of his intricate lace rochet provided a sharp, violent contrast, the delicate spiderweb-thin threads catching the illumination like frost on winter foliage. With every measured step, the heavy, dark leather of his polished shoes squeaked softly against the uneven stone flags, a rhythmic, grounding sound that anchored the ethereal solemnity of the moment. On his right hand, heavily adorned and resting with calculated nonchalance against his chest, rested a massive, unblemished sapphire ring, a cold, dark stone that glinted with a deeply buried, subterranean light, a mere prelude to the chromatic spectacle that was about to unfold. He was trailed by an entourage of high-ranking clerics and grim-faced acolytes, their own vestments a subdued symphony of deep purples, muted golds, and charcoal grays, moving in perfect gimbal-like unison, swinging intricate silver thuribles that rhythmically clinked and expelled fresh, billowing clouds of thick, fragrant smoke, adding yet another layer of atmospheric density to
Chapter 14. Centuries of Light.
Time in this space seemed to flow differently, not in uniform motion, but in the thick, viscous rhythm of settling dust and cooling wax. In the silence of the Renaissance palazzo, when the last patrons had long since passed into the dust of history and their power had turned to ash, Raphael's masterpiece endured in unwavering stillness, becoming a silent witness to the ages. The montage of centuries begins with the soft, pulsing light of beeswax candles that for decades cast dancing, ephemeral shadows onto the canvas, drawing from the darkness the deep tones of ochre and Sienese earth. A camera close-up, as in a meditative documentary, reveals the microscopic surface of the painting. The varnish, initially transparent as morning dew, begins over the years to yellow gently, taking on the color of old amber. The first fine cracks appear, the craquelure forming on the surface of the organic pigments, a network resembling dried riverbeds in a desert. The madder reds and tin yellows slowly lose their original youthful vitality, surrendering to the inexorable process of oxidation and photodegradation. But at the very heart of this slow, majestic decomposition, the Madonna's mantle gleams with unshaken, almost arrogant force. The inorganic structure of lapis lazuli, imprisoned in hardened linseed oil, rejects the destructive influence of time, reflecting the warm glow of candles with the same crystalline purity with which it did so on the day the master's brush last lifted from the canvas. The light around the painting shifts slowly, passing through hundreds of thousands of sunrises and sunsets, while the blue remains unchanged, a transcendent fixed point in the churning ocean of impermanence, the absolute triumph of geology over the fragility of human existence.
Chapter 15. The Unveiling of the Unseen.
In the sterile, thoroughly modern interior of the National Laboratory for the Conservation of Artworks, where the cool of the air conditioning and the soundless hum of advanced research equipment created an atmosphere of almost religious concentration, the light seemed to play by rules established centuries ago by masters of chiaroscuro. This space, though dominated by stainless steel, glass, and the matte surfaces of monitor screens, was enveloped in deep, almost reverential darkness, broken only by precisely aimed, pinpoint beams of halogen light. Those sharp rays, as in the dramatic compositions of Caravaggio, drew from the darkness the focal point of the room. Raphael Santi's masterpiece, resting on a massive, pneumatically stabilized table. The painting, removed from its heavy gilded frame and stripped of its protective layers of darkened varnish, presented itself in all its exposed, defenseless truth. Its colors, though subdued by the weight of centuries, still vibrated with inner life. The palette, dominated by earthy tones, deep ochres, burnt siennas, cool umbers, and subtle flesh-like shades, formed a backdrop against which the sudden, unexpected appearance of the vibrating, luminous blue of ultramarine struck with the force of revelation. The Madonna's Mantle, painted with extraordinary lyrical softness, constituted the visual and emotional center of the canvas, and its color, even after 500 years, radiated an unmatched depth, a window opened onto the infinity of the night sky. In this sterile space, where the past met the future, a team of the finest scientists and conservators was preparing for an unprecedented intervention, whose purpose was not repair, but understanding, the final unraveling of the mystery of the matter from which this elusive beauty had been born. Every movement they made, slow and deliberate, recorded by the discreet eye of a documentary camera, resembled the choreography of an ancient ritual, adapted to the rigors of modern science, where reverence for the Creator's genius mingled with the relentless desire to discover the truth hidden at the molecular level.